Welcome, Richard. Welcome to the Basis Project. One of my researchers passed me your link to a lecture you did on January the 27th, and well, bloody hell. It's a very, very serious. We've just been looking at it here on a DVD. I've made it into a DVD so we can watch it without the interference with possibly it not being there next time you want to look. What the Basis Project, or what I've been doing, is I like to get down to the detail and as technical as possible so that as much is recorded in the actual interview or presentation as is technically available at the time. And if somebody can't understand it, they can always look at it later or look it up at some other time. So you have got a presentation for us. And could you describe really why should we pay any attention to what you're saying? Because what you're saying is very important. What right do you have to say it? And how do you know it's right or wrong or anything like that? I mean, why would we pay any attention to somebody like you?
Fair question. I sometimes feel that way myself when I'm getting up presenting at places. In fairness, people should know that way back in 1976, I was selected to be with the American Heart Association, and I became the youngest faculty member at that point in time. And with that came a few responsibilities. One was to help work with and modify the basic cardiac life support protocols and the advanced cardiac life support protocols. But it also included another area, which was something known as the Physician Cholesterol Education Faculty. And that faculty was when we started talking to people, the general public and physicians alike, about what caused heart disease and what types of things needed to be done to address it. And in that era, it was very much cholesterol. And cholesterol does, in fact, play a role, but it certainly is not the only thing. And it took me a few decades to work out some of the details on that. In fairness, it wasn't until about 1984, after I had been presenting for several decades and teaching for several decades, and I'd already completed my fellowship in cardiology and looked at errors that were being made in diagnostic imaging and was working on correcting that I went back and started looking at not only cardiology literature, but the other specialties in medicine, the other specialties in science. And then, of course, I needed to go beyond the United States. And that led me to about 400 to 500 papers that I put together into what became known as the inflammation and cardiovascular disease theory, or the Fleming cardiovascular disease theory, or inflammation and heart disease. Depends upon who you talk to about it. It has different names. And in that theory, I explained that heart disease was or is an inflammothrombotic process. That is to say, it's a process that has inflammation or swelling, and it's a process that has associated blood clots. So it's an inflammothrombotic response. And at that point in time, I think, I don't know if it's one of the slides in this presentation. Yes, it is. It's slide number 10. I actually came out and explained that bacteria and viruses are part of the cause of that inflammation and blood clotting. And in fact, if you look at the Hamburg publications and you look at a number of other series of papers that are looking at SARS-CoV-2, you'll find out that the people are dying with inflammothrombotic disease, just as the theory presented in 1994. So that's one reason. The fact that the original theory that explains this was one that I presented in 94 at American Heart. Even though I was faculty, it wasn't viewed fondly at the time. I presented again in 95. It got published in a textbook in 99. From 2000 to 2003, I published a couple papers on the bacterial entities involved with this inflammatory process. So that was Helicobacter pylori and Streptococcus pneumoniae and Chlamydia pneumoniae. And then in 2004, I presented on 2020 the inflammation and heart disease process, and they were more interested in the dietary components, but certainly the other issues. And then during my cardiology fellowship years from 89 to 92, I happened to be in the right place at the right time or at the wrong place at the wrong time, depending upon your perspective, where the new nuclear isotopes were coming out, the technetium tracers. And I wrote one of the first SPECT papers and did some of the first PET work. In fact, I did PET imaging on the Dean Ornish patients, so I was intimately involved in both of those areas. And again, very similar to the cholesterol stuff. The party line at that time was that you had to give 2 injections of these isotopes to make them work. Although we got prettier pictures, but the problem is prettier pictures don't necessarily mean accurate pictures. So my involvement in fellowship years from 89 to 92 looked at errors that were being made both with coronary angiography and with nuclear imaging, and corrected those errors. And then I followed up with that when I got into private practice about 1999 and started trying to quantify those images. And in the quantification of those images, one of the pharmaceutical companies came up to me and wanted to know if I would include breast cancer imaging in with my cardiac patients. And I looked at them somewhat strangely at the time because, as a cardiologist, as a nuclear cardiologist, I don't think of myself as doing breast cancer imaging, although I'm qualified to do it. And I told them I'd think about it. They certainly presented some interesting concerns about women and men not getting imaged. So I looked at it and agreed to go ahead if I could do it without increasing the radiation to anybody, increasing any harm, and if they were people that also had heart disease that we're worried about. And in doing that, I discovered something that eventually came back to bite me. I discovered that the information from the pharmaceutical companies about how many injections of this isotope you needed were wrong. And looking back on it, it's very clear to me that they intentionally downplayed it, because the competition was between 2 nuclear tracers, one that became called sestamibie and one that was called tebaroxime. I wrote the first SPECT paper on tebaroxime, and the imaging sequence is such that tebaroxime you had to image right away. And sestamibie, the story line from Big Pharma was, you don't have to image right away. In fact, if you just wait an hour, that's fine. And that made it much more appealing for the people running the nuclear tests, because scheduling was a problem. If they had to do things right away, that really was challenging for them. So the concept that sestamibie didn't really show up until half an hour to 45 minutes to an hour later was very advantageous, and it basically took over the market, with tebaroxime just kind of going by the wayside. Well, it turns out that when that same company came to me to do the breast cancer imaging, the breast cancer imaging had to be done at about 5 minutes, which is about the same time that we would have looked for heart disease with tebaroxime. And in doing those images with breast cancer, we also got heart images, and I then compared those images later on with the standard 1 hour images, and discovered that they were different. That the isotope really did move around, or what's called redistribute. And what that meant was that instead of giving 2 doses of the isotope to get the comparison images, you only needed 1 dose. And so I went ahead and started doing single injections and doing the images sooner and later, so at 5 minutes and an hour for this isotope. It varies from different isotopes, but for this one. And I ended up, frankly, going to federal court, being indicted for billing fraud, because I dared to bill for 2 sets of images, even though I only gave 1 injection of the isotope. Now, it turns out that all the data, all the evidence showing that was right and defending me was blocked, not only by the public defender, but by the judge. So that never got presented, and it caused a lot of confusion. But since then, Yale University, Harvard University, Cedars-Sinai, University of Berlin, Johns Hopkins University, Emory have all shown the same thing, that if you take these early images, you find disease that is missed by the conventional approach. And what that did is it once people recognize that, it changes how much of the isotope you have to buy from big pharma, and for big pharma that amounted to $20 billion in lost profits. So they weren't happy, but it's obviously a terrible thing to do a more accurate image with less radiation and to do it faster. Also, in doing that, however, I discovered that the images themselves were wrong in many instances, because the prettier we tried to make the pictures, the smaller the pixel sizes for resolution, the less information was being collected, and so the visual images were being based upon poorer and poorer image acquisition.
Sorry,
And
how does
I
that work? I mean, surely if you're dealing with better images and more resolution, you should get more
no,
information.
No, I mean, so the problem is that there's modulator transfer factor problems that occur as a result of having finer and finer pixels. And when we did the analysis of it, um, it's very simple to do. I mean, the physics. My original degree is a doctorate in physics, and the physics of isotope decay doesn't change even if humans want it to. So we discovered that by actually analyzing how well the cameras counted, and we discovered this modulation transfer function and a couple other factors, Fourier transfer, that interfered with the collection of the data. And it turns out that um, the pixel sizes, if you set them correctly for any given camera, can actually accurately measure. And once we discovered that, then we started this measurement
Sorry,
phenomenon.
does
And
that mean that because the native resolution of the camera, we are over interpreting the data to get the finer resolution, but you weren't getting a true resolution?
right, I mean, and while it looked prettier, we were losing about 35 to 34 to 35% of the radiation counts. And so the image, and one of the problems that's always been present in nuclear almost since day one is that the more sophisticated the computer systems have become, uh, the more assumptions people have made with equipment and the poorer quality wiring and just a variety of factors, because you can always tweak it. And the problem is that when humans start tweaking things, they start making interpretive errors, and that's really what has happened. And so by going to this quantitative method, I developed something called the Fleming method for tissue and vascular differentiation and metabolism, which now has been shortened to Fleming method. I thought FMTVDM was short enough. So just for your listeners, the patent is called the Fleming method for tissue and vascular differentiation and metabolism using same state singular sequential quantification comparisons. So I thought FMTVDM was short enough, but
Oh, I don't know.
I
I think
actually,
that's a much better thing to just spell it out there. Yeah, but this is crucial in terms
yeah,
of false data, false imaging, based on
absolutely.
over
Yeah.
analyzing the problem, so to speak.
Yeah, it's critical, and what it did is it provided it. So the patent got issued in 2017, after about 2 decades of work, and it quantitatively measures, and that's valuable because really what FMTVDM or Fleming method does is it measures regional changes in blood flow and tissue metabolism. Well, we were using that primarily for heart disease and breast cancer and getting ready to apply it to other cancers. And then along the scene in 2019 comes something, SARS-CoV-2. And SARS-CoV-2, we already knew based upon the breast cancer data where the inflammatory, inflammothrombotic readings were. And so, you know, when you're looking at SARS-CoV-2 and you're trying to assess it, there's really three different ways that you can do it. You can get an antigen test. You can look to see if some protein is present, and that's what the PCR tests are. So, the swabbing of the nasopharynx or the oropharynx, the nose or the throat, is looking for genetic material. Now, that's all it's doing. And so I frequently emphasize that PCR test is a really outstanding test for what it was designed for. The problem is it's being used for something it wasn't designed for. It was designed to see if there's a genetic sequence of something present. Now, whether it's alive or what to do with it clinically or how severe the disease might occur. So that was never the intention of PCR
Is the
testing.
is the intention really to collect genetic data on people?
Well, the purpose of PCR is to look at a series of a sample and say, is that genetic material present? Period. And it, but it doesn't do anything more than that. So I've always been mind boggled by the fact that we're using, this test was issued as an emergency use authorization. And now this emergency use authorization PCR test is now being used to determine if other emergency use drugs and vaccines, which are drugs, are working. So you've got, something that hasn't really been approved for a purpose, checking something else that really hasn't been approved for treatment. Um, so you've got the antigen testing, you've got antibody testing, which tells you if your body's immune system has responded to it with antibodies by B cells, which doesn't even address whether T cells are involved. And the biggest problem that I see there is that the antibody tests that are frequently looked for are IgG and IgM. So IgG is chronic. It's the typical Y-shaped antibody that people see, and IgM is the acute phase, which is a pentamer 5 component, which is great. However, this is a respiratory and gastrointestinal primarily virus, and the antibody to look for there is IgA. And except for one animal study that I saw that was looking at SARS-CoV-2, nobody seems to talk about IgA. And then there's tissue, and tissue can be done one of two ways. You can either go in and sample, which is what we've been doing when we go into the lungs with something called bronchoalveolar lavage, which is where we go in the lungs with a fiber optic scope and we look for material. We put some saline in there and suck it back out and try to draw material out, and then look at it under a microscope and see if people can agree amongst themselves about what the severity is. Or you can actually do FMTVDM. And that's the real advantage of FMTVDM, is the ability to measure the inflammatory thrombotic response, both from the virus infecting an area and the immune response to it in the area. And so the reason why you should listen to me is, A, I produced the theory that actually explains it, and B, I developed the test that can actually measure it. And the benefit of FMTVDM, or Fleming method, is that not only can it define the extent and severity of the disease, but it can monitor treatment real time, and the treatments, if the treatments are working, they're going to show up in 72 hours. And the reason for that is that if you look at the drugs that are used, people sometimes wonder how we prescribe medications. And the medications are based upon what's called half-life, or the amount of time it takes for half of the drug to be gone out of your system one way or another. And so there's something called plasma steady state concentration, or CPSS, concentration plasma steady state. And what that means is that it takes 5 half-lives of a drug to reach that level. And if a drug is going to work for SARS-CoV-2 or high blood pressure or heart failure or high cholesterol or whatever, it's going to work within 5 half-lives. And so if you look at the drugs that are useful for SARS-CoV-2, 5 half-lives gets you under 72 hours. So FMTVDM was used not only in our study to look at how severe the disease was to begin with, once they had acquired COVID-19, which is the disease versus the virus. And then every 72 hours, we would modify treatment until we found treatments that worked, and that allowed us to tailor make treatments that actually work for SARS-CoV-2. So that was a long explanation, but unfortunately, I'm not sure there's a shorter one. You should have, I think, unfortunately, in the age of Twitter, people are used to 144 characters, and yet, when you go to university or you really go to a course to learn something, it takes a little bit longer than 144 characters, and you can't quite do it on Twitter yet.
Well, you got all the time you want here, and that's a very detailed explanation, and it's a very important explanation because there's been some mud thrown at people in this business, and some of the mud sticks, and it's very important to get a really serious and proper explanation. So do feel free to tell us everything. Don't paraphrase anything. But this is not Twitter.
Yeah.
So do we want to get on with the presentation, sir?
Sure, let's go ahead and so this is kind of the abbreviated version of mine, and let me see if I can get my screen here a little bit bigger. So yes, I'd love to do that. Let's
Severe acute respiratory syndrome.
right, and so this is obviously a virus that is named after the clinical consequences, which is that it produces severe, acute, sudden respiratory breathing problems syndrome. That's how it gets the term SARS. And then CoV-2 is coronavirus 2. And people are used to shoving coronavirus together. We don't do that for any other virus. Don't do that for herpes virus. We don't do that for HIV. We don't do that for respiratory syncytial virus. We don't do it for adenovirus. Um, so this is coronavirus 2. Corona, crown, which people are used to saying, which we have a slide of that will show you. And then 2019 was the year that everybody became painfully aware of it, although it's clear, I think, that this virus probably leaked out of the lab in September. And interestingly enough, the computer files at the Wuhan Virology Institute were wiped in June and July of 2019 of much of the data surrounding this particular virus. And then potential conflicts of interest, obviously, the FMTVDM and the theory that I just talked about. So, I think when you have somebody who gives you a presentation for whatever purpose and they don't define, look, I'm including what I know, and part of what I know is what I've developed. And if they don't admit to conflicts of interest, real conflicts of interest. I mean, there's conflict of interest that I'm breathing oxygen on the planet, and therefore I might have a conflict of interest of what's going on in the air. It needs to be a legitimate conflict of interest. So, conflict of interest, or an interesting thing. There's a lot of people who love to jump on just about anything as a conflict of interest. I think serious conflicts of interest are the ones to point out, like I just pointed out, because you could. It's a valid statement and question. I think we're going to see a lot of conflicts of interest in the United States and Wuhan Virology Institute in the next few slides, and things that are actually going on. And I think those conflict of interests are critical for people to know. And it's astonishing to me. I'm this year is, I think, my 52nd, possibly 53rd year of doing research, and it's astonishing to me what people consider as credible scientists. We have a lot of people that are playing what I consider pseudoscientists because they just love to be part of the conversation, and I understand that. I mean, you go to a party. We used to go to parties, and people would always want to be part of the conversation. I get that, but there's a point in time to listen at the conversation and to learn something from the people that do know what they're talking about instead of pretending to. And I have some real concerns about many of the people that have been involved in the discussion about SARS-CoV-2. I don't think it's in the slide, although it may be. But one of the points of the importance of science is that in 2007 there was a research project funded by the National Science Foundation, and the research was done at the University of Indiana, in France and in Italy. And the function of that research project, which was an infectious disease research project, was to determine what do you do if you believe that you have a virus or a bacteria or a fungus or some type of biological entity that has the potential of producing a pandemic. And the conclusion of that study was that you immediately shut down international travel. Now, the reason for pointing this out at this point in time is that when SARS-CoV-2 occurred, and the President of the United States at the time, President Donald Trump, was making a decision about whether to shut down international travel or not. He shut down international travel despite the recommendations from Dr. Anthony Fauci at the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, who said shutting down the travel was not important. So Dr. Fauci has frequently been viewed as America's scientist, right? I mean, it's hard to turn on the television or the internet and not hear him being described as that. So here he is. He is head of NIAID, the very government agency that should be aware of any research that was done like this, and that was published in 2007. And so at the time, this expert scientist, physician, I remember, made a comment that it wasn't necessary to shut down international travel. And the problem that I have with that is that as a credible scientist in charge of the US organization in charge of infectious diseases that should have known about a study paid for by the National Science Foundation, he recommended that travel did not need to be shut down. So either he was unaware of it, had read it but had forgotten it, or had some other reason for not making that statement. But he didn't come up and say, well, I'm not sure I agree with this, but Mr. President and people of the United States and the world, there was this study done and paid for out of the U.S. back in 2007, and yet his comment was not to shut down international travel. And so, as a scientist, as a credible scientist, when everybody talks about stepping up, I mean, look, at one point in time, I told people that you needed 2 doses of these isotopes to do cardiac imaging because that was the party line I was told. That was what I was publishing papers on. But I eventually acquiesced and said, wait a minute, that's incorrect. At one point in time, I told people that cholesterol was primarily the thing driving heart disease. But over the course of time, I've turned around. I've said, well, it's not. I mean, it's a part of it, but it's certainly not necessary, and it plays a different role in different people. So to set the record straight, it's this inflammatory process that I put the theory with my name attached to it. I have people that come and listen to me at presentations, and literally they have said, well, Dr. Fleming, that's not what you said 5 years ago. And, one of the first things that comes to my mind is that I think you must have really a very boring life if you're watching me and following me around the world. I've been in London. I've been at the QE2 Center lecturing on heart disease and inflammation. I think it may have been one of the first places that I actually talked about, where I talked about cholesterol and triglycerides and fibrinogen and homocysteine and live protein low A and bacteria and viruses. And in fact, I did it in the Fleming conference room at QE2. So it was a little bit surreal doing that. But I always tell people, look, I have no idea what I'm going to say until the presentation comes up, and I'm putting together the most recent data, because my goal is to put together what's right, not to just make myself look good, because I think the way that you make yourself look good is you present the real data. And then the beauty of doing it properly is that other people will eventually report very similar things, so that the inflammation and heart disease theory, which is what I will always call it since I came up with it, is now considered by many scientific fact. But because I came up with it, I will always only call it a theory. The work that we did for treatments of SARS-CoV-2, many other individuals, which we'll get to in slides, have done similar things, although not with randomized controlled clinical trials as we did, but they're coming up with the same numbers. And not only does that validate my work, but I view it also that my work then helps to validate theirs. And it's that consistency that provides scientific integrity and knowledge and moving forward, as opposed to continuing to behave like ostriches with their heads in the sand, just hoping and praying that the world will get better on its own. And as you're going to see here in the course of the next few slides, that's not going to happen naturally.
Well, science is evolving, and we have another slide here. Do you wish to go to that now?
Yes, please. So one of the obvious reasons for people to listen to this presentation is because it's important to them. I mean, SARS-CoV-2 has produced a pandemic around the world, although at this time I would argue it's an endemic because it's here. It's not going anywhere. It's produced a devastating loss of lives. I'm not sure if we're up to 2 million internationally. I know we're over 500,000 in the US, although I would argue that the vast majority of that is a failure to actually treat the inflammatory thrombotic response more so than just the virus itself. It's separated people. It's isolated people in lockdowns. It's prevented people from seeing family members in the hospital, in nursing homes, the absence of family gatherings and social events. I mean, human beings are social beings, and it's our interaction with each other that gives us much of who we are. And so stripping that away from people has been a very effective tool for controlling and preventing people from truly sharing information. And it also then forces people to depend upon certain other sources to get their news. And if that news source is controlled, I'm not saying it is, but if it's controlled, then what you hear and believe is exactly what people want you to hear and believe. It's resulted in a tremendous loss of personal liberty, not just in the United States, but all over the world. I mean, I certainly watched a lot of what was going on in the UK with the lockdowns, and you can see the fear and the devastation of people. It also resulted in the circumvention of protective mechanisms, as we're going to see here with gain of function, because there were mechanisms put in place to stop things like gain of function research from going on. And yet the very people that are now held up as the heroes and the people to listen to as scientists appear to be the same people who have circumvented the protections to prevent something like gain of function disaster that's happened. And it has resulted in the largest experimental study in the history of mankind. And by that, I mean the vaccines, because the vaccines, as we know them, are experimental drugs. These emergency use authorizations mean exactly that. They are experimental. And in the absence of informed consent and people being told what these vaccines really do and how they work and what their potential benefits are and what isn't known, without that informed consent, there are a number of national and international laws being broken, and people need to be held legally and criminally accountable for doing that.
Well, the target of this is to provide informed consent.
Absolutely. I mean, informed consent is something that happens between a doctor and a patient. And I know we don't address too much the vaccines in this PowerPoint. So let me take a brief moment here, since YouTube saw fit to have removed the emergency use authorization discussion that I just did on the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, although they left up the emergency use authorization explanations that I did of the Pfizer Moderna vaccines. We're going to get to the fact that this is a gain of function virus, which means that the genetics of this virus are man-made, or at least man-modified. And that means that the mRNA in the Pfizer Moderna vaccines are also man-made, non-real. They are not naturally occurring. So when people acquire this virus from person to person by respiratory pathway, the amount of virus that can actually infect a cell is limited to the ACE receptor. Now, in fairness, the ACE receptor is not the only receptor that's involved. There is a TMPRSS2 or transmembrane protein series 2 receptor, along with the ACE2 receptor, the furin cleavage site, and neuropilin 1. So let's go to this, and we can hit on the vaccines later on here. This is evidence that the United States is directly involved in the payment and federal funding of the development of SARS-CoV-2 through something called gain of function research. And gain of function means you have increased the ability of the virus to infect and cause pathogenic problems within people. So the original look at that we're doing here begins with NIH grant AI 23946-08 that was issued to Dr. Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina in Chapel Hill. Now, to be fair, Dr. Barrick is not the only one involved in the United States, but we're going to focus on one of the major groups of individuals here because his research began roughly about 2000 to 2002. And this NIAID grant issued out of Dr. Fauci's control was issued in 2003. And most researchers will tell you that a grant really pays for what has already been done because the federal government likes to see results for its work. So the way it routinely happens is you do research, you get a result, you submit a grant for that, and then that funding gets used for the next phase of research, plus it pays for what you already did. And that allows you to then turn around and tell the federal government, see, I actually accomplished something with your money. Because if you did it the way that everybody else thinks that research is done, you got a grant to do something, then you went and you did it, and it didn't pan out. Well, you would never get another grant because the government would say, well, that was wasted money. We got nothing for it. Bye bye. Don't come back to us. So in 2003, Barrick began his work on the family of viruses called coronaviridie, or coronaviruses. And he did it for the express purpose of increasing some general research, detection, manipulation, potential therapeutics, but also for enhancing the pathogenicity of this virus. And by the 21st of May 2000, Barrick reported that he has successfully rescued infectious clones of the virus through reverse genetics. And what you're seeing is that these reverse genetics then got played over to, by April of 2002, to recombinant DNA. And what you're seeing in the image here is a host plasmid, which is a circular set of DNA in which you insert from another species genetic material, and that's called recombinant or chimeric DNA. So a chimer is, in old days, Greek mythology, what Roman mythology was, a lion and a dragon and multiple animals put together. That's a chimer. And the goal of his April 2002 outcome was that he produced an infectious, replicable, defective coronavirus. And it was funded, again, by National Institutes of Health, thanks to the U.S. taxpayers. And it should be noted that the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services has been funding amplification research along this line between 1999 and 2002, which is before the original SARS-CoV virus was detected in China. Specifically, SARS-CoV-1 and SARS-CoV-2, if we look at it, Dr. Shang Li in 2002 reported work inserting an HIV pseudovirus glycoprotein 120 insert into SARS-CoV-1. The 2007 grant there is the information I referred to earlier with the travel ban. Should anybody have reason to believe that there's an infection that is going to become a pandemic, to shut down international travel. That's Indiana University. I think I said the University of Indiana before. My apologies to them. In 2013, the Middle Eastern variety showed up, which had a significant morbidity and mortality of 30 to 40%. It showed up not only in the Middle East, but also South Korea. Research at that point in time, that blue does not show up very well, my apologies, showed that rhesus macaques that were infected with it responded well if ribavirin and interferon alpha-2 beta were used. But the important thing, above and beyond the fact that the animals could be treated successfully, was that you had to begin treatment almost immediately. And this is true of any viral infection. And so delays by telling people to simply go home and only come into a hospital or be seen if they become extremely symptomatic loses valuable time in controlling a viral infection that needs to be addressed sooner than later. By 2013, Zhang Li and the Wuhan Virology Institute reported that they'd isolated 3 bats viruses with an HKU4 spike protein. That spike protein itself was not able to infect people, although thanks to some re-engineering that they did in 2015, with 2 single mutations. So this is Shang Li and Zhang Li rather, telling us directly that they intentionally altered this HKU spike protein to allow it to infect human cells. By 2015, Barrick and Zhang Li was warning the world that in fact not only could they build chimeric viruses, non-naturally occurring viruses, but they could make more dangerous, virulent, and infectious ones. So that was 2015. We should have been forewarned. Interestingly enough, in 2018, one of the major presentations that was done in Shanghai on bat viruses, coronaviruses, and cross-species infectivity, presented in November 2018, has since been deleted from the university website. If anybody has that, I'd love to get a copy of it. I've heard from it, but I'm a skeptic because I'm certainly the type of person who believes in seeing it for myself. So if we're able to share, I might be able to show this. And what I'd really like to do at this point in time is to see if I can show the next slide to you. Let's see here. And so share screen if I can. And I believe you can see that. And so this is a virologist interviewing Peter Daszak, and I editorialize here a couple times for people, and hopefully this will be loud enough for you to hear, and certainly make people aware. What you're going to hear is a series of conversations between this virologist and Mr. Daszak, who is in charge of EcoHealth. Mr. Daszak got federal funds through Dr. Fauci and a variety of other federal agencies to do gain-of-function research, and he pays Ralph Barrick. You'll hear him make a comment that they pay Ralph Barrick at the University of North Carolina to do some of this, and then you're going to hear a segment with an Italian research journalist talking with Dr. Ralph Barrick, where he admits that, you know, and this is news, I think, probably to most people, we don't actually need the viruses anymore. We know the genetic codes of most things, including SARS-CoV-2. And the Human Genome Project completed in about 2002, 2003, where we were able to sequence the vast majority of the human genome. And so we're very good now at finding out what makes something. And one of the things about Moderna is that it started off as Darwinian, I think it was chemical something, which, you know, is responsible for one of the mRNA vaccines. But it got originally grant funding from the U.S. government, and its purpose is to produce life from non-life. So to take the genetic sequence, put it together, and put it inside cells to get viruses and other life forms to exist by simply sequencing the genetic material. And then you're going to hear Ralph Barrick admit that if they didn't want you to know that what they made was made in a human lab, they can make it look like it's naturally occurring. So let's listen to these few minutes, if you would, please.
But if you say these are diverse coronaviruses and you can't vaccinate against them, there are no antivirals, what do we do?
Well, so I think that coronaviruses are pretty good. I mean, you're a virologist, you know all this stuff, but you can manipulate them in the lab pretty easily. It's just spike protein drives a lot of what happens with the coronavirus, zoonotic risk. So you can get the sequence.
Emphasize here, the spike protein drives it, and you can get the genetic sequence.
And build the protein, and we work with Ralph Barrick at UNC to do this. Insert into the backbone of another virus,
right,
and do some work in the lab.
In other words, a chimer. He's admitting that EcoHealth, with the funds that have been provided from the federal government, has worked with Professor Barrick at the University of North Carolina to take one part of a coronavirus and another part of some other virus and a coronavirus and insert the spike protein that will infect people into the naturally occurring coronavirus by having the genetic sequences to do that and make a chimer. This is Professor Barrick being interviewed by an Italian investigative journalist on viruses and his work with Dr. Shang Li, her work with them at University of North Carolina, and his work with her over at Wuhan Institute of Virology.
We had no access to the viruses in China. All we had was access to the sequence.
There were two teams in the world who were very good at making chimeric viruses, and they were both working on SARS-like coronaviruses. One in North Carolina under Ralph Baric, and one in Wuhan under Xi Zhengli, and they both developed techniques for combining two different parts of different viruses into one virus, the backbone of one virus and the spike protein from another virus.
Can you hide that?
They warned the world in a publication in 2015, jointly between Professor Barrick's team, Xi Zhengli's team.
What you're going to hear next should concern you even more, because here is the admission from Barrick and Shang Li that this investigative reporter found in the published documents, that they can make an even more virulent, nasty Frankenstein's monster, chimer, to cause a pandemic.
That they were capable of making more dangerous pathogens, and that this was a risky line of research.
Avete dato al virus una marcia in più? Lo avete potenziato?
The only gain of function that occurred in that virus is that we changed its antigenicity. And what that data tells you is that any vaccine or antibody that you've made against the original virus from 2003 wasn't going to protect the public against this new virus if it should emerge in the future.
Se guardassimo il genoma della vostra chimera, capiremmo che era stata fatta in laboratorio?
Anything that we build in the laboratory has what are called signature mutations. It's like a little, it's where you sign your name, almost. It says, you put in these mutations, and it says, this was built from material in the Barrick laboratory.
Ma se non vuoi lasciare questa firma, puoi costruire in laboratorio un virus indistinguibile da uno naturale, giusto?
It is correct. You can do it without leaving a signature, yes. We're using any of the 3 or 4 different approaches for coronaviruses that were developed by different researchers. You can leave no trace that it was made in the laboratory.
Okay, so I will get that to you and you can play it in the edit. How's that? Does that work?
That'll be fine.
Okay, perfect. It is it's really outstanding to listen to and to actually listen to somebody admit that they have done this.
That's your next slide. That's your next slide from this end.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is a nice example of some of the funding that has been paid to Peter Daszak at EcoHealth with the express purpose of gain-of-function research. And what you notice at the very top with Health and Human Services, you'll see I highlighted in yellow the Nipah virus, which is currently in the India subcontinent. And my understanding is that the mortality is right around 100% for the Nipah virus. Peter Daszak and his group at EcoHealth is involved in experimentation with the Nipah virus. But you can see here multiple grants by Health and Human Services, multiple grants by both in the upper and lower, and the Department of Defense, which I think is important to realize, because the Department of Defense is not really working with the Girl Scouts and the Boy Scouts. I mean, the Department of Defense really has only certain specific things that it's doing, and it's all related to military purposes. So you have all of these grants being provided from the Department of Defense to Peter Daszak at EcoHealth, which I think is fairly significant information to wrap your brain around, to say, why would a military agency be investing in this? So yeah, you really have to ask the question, why is the Department of Defense, why is the National Institutes of Health, why is Health and Human Services all investing this money in EcoHealth and investing money in gain of function research?
Who's funding it? I mean, who's the person actually deciding to give it to the Department of Defense?
Well, I don't know who has it, control of it at the Department of Defense. I think that would be a really good question. But we know who's in charge of it at NIAID,
And who's
and
that?
that would be Anthony Fauci. He's in charge of it.
What about the data which suggests that this was also invented here in the UK at Pirbright, the Pirbright Institute?
I have to admit, I don't know any of that information, although I have heard that the United States, I've heard that the UK, and I've heard that Israel have all been involved in it at one point in time, and clearly China also. So I don't have those papers, but certainly if somebody is aware of that, I would love to see them. Because again, I think that anybody who's been involved in this gain of function research that produced a virus that then got out and had this devastating effect, and anybody who's interfering with the use of treatments that have been shown to be successful, and anyone promoting the use of experimental vaccines without informed consent, that each and every one of these people need to be held legally and criminally accountable.
Well,
I mean,
just so you understand, that
Yeah.
source that told me that is U.S. Special Forces, which were based in the UK, now live in Europe.
But
That's all we can say.
Yeah. There are a number of people. I get data, I get information from a variety of sources. I have, and I guess I'm not going to say anything more than that, for the protection of those sources, although those sources will clearly stand up at a point in time that we hold tribunals for these people. But of course, everybody, I think at this point in time is this, I think this is beginning to unravel for these people. I think what has happened, I started giving presentations here in Texas about 2.5 weeks ago. And one of the things that I have been just admiring and awed by is that the people are not as stupid as I think the people in power that are behind this.
That's a very, very important point. People don't know why they buy a particular car or they buy a particular product, but they know when they're being conned.
Right.
And they're being conned. Or are they being conned? Is there malice aforethought here?
Well, I've tried to, I try to give everybody the benefit of the doubt. I mean, even that pharmaceutical company, I tried to give the benefit of the doubt because I thought, well, maybe they just didn't know. But the reality is, I've done correspondence with them and I've published papers showing the correspondence with them where I've said, wait a minute, now here is the research behind it. And what they've done with the FDA is they've gone to the FDA and they've said, well, the drug, yeah, it redistributes, but we don't tell doctors how to practice medicine. And we don't really care anymore because there's not profit in it for us anymore because it's now generic and it's off patent. When you get to the point where you start to see people make decisions after the fact and they have the information that shows the consequences, now you have to hold them. I think they have to be held accountable. People ask questions about why would they be doing gain of function research? Well, gosh, as I've already said, with 52 years of research, I will be one of the first people to tell you if there's an interesting research project that I think should be done, and you give me the opportunity to do it, I will probably do it. Okay. But there's a point in time that as a researcher, you wake up and you go, well, maybe this is more dangerous than not. And so the point is this: if they were doing research on SARS-CoV-2 with all the best of intentions, whatever that might be, They were trying to develop an treatment regimen in case somebody else attacked the country, or they wanted to see what would happen if mutations actually happened, and therefore protect people. All well and good, but we're past that point. We're at a point now where the chimer escaped, okay, either intentionally or accidentally. Who knows? But the point is, it happened, and there were consequences, and those consequences continued and snowballed and got worse and worse and worse. And there's millions of dead people now. There's millions of dead people. Nation states have been put at odds against each other. People have been locked down. Even that first funding that went around to Americans in the United States that was passed in 2020 to give stimulus checks did so with part of the Patriot Act being re-signed into law. I mean, we're past the point of oops. We're to the point of you did something you shouldn't have done, and you didn't tell somebody that there was a problem, and you had this knowledge base about how detrimental it was, and why are we having to drag this out of you? The fact that the powers that be continue to misrepresent things, that all of that speaks poorly. It speaks intentional and knowingly, and that makes it criminal.
Well, these sort of questions we can answer or look at later. Do you want to continue with your presentation?
Please.
Because this is
Yeah.
really fascinating. There's lots of things I'd like to say, but I prefer to get on. Okay.
So, and again, here's more funding from the National Science Foundation, USAID, Department of the Interior, USDA, Department of Homeland Security. More than $61 million just in what I was able to find went to EcoHealth for gain of function. And it's not just EcoHealth. If you look at the bottom of the slide, the gain of function research has gone to University of Texas and Iowa and Chicago and Maryland. I mean, I'm a graduate of Iowa and UT. Vanderbilt University, Washington University. I mean, these are the universities that are doing gain of function research. And we're already seeing the consequences of SARS-CoV-2 of gain of function research, which is the production of more infectious viruses. And we know, not only does SARS-CoV-2 produce this inflammatory thrombotic response, but people have gone back and looked at influenza A, and about 12% of all myocardial infarctions, damage to the heart, or what the lay public calls a heart attack, although they're not quite exactly the same thing, is caused by an inflammatory thrombotic response. So 12% of the people who die with influenza A die from an inflammatory thrombotic response producing a myocardial infarction in people. So it's not just SARS-CoV-2. The problem is that every one of these viruses can be treated, but you have to treat the site of infection, you have to treat the issue of replication, and you have to treat the inflammatory thrombotic response. So not only have the treatments not focused on treating the inflammatory thrombotic response, attachment, replication, but we've known since the early 2000s how to set ventilators correctly on patients who have this inflammation in their lungs associated with these acute respiratory distress syndromes. And the truth is that the ventilators, every time they breathe for somebody, gives what's called a tidal volume. And that tidal volume is about 10 cc's per kilogram body weight. And we know that you have to set it for half of that, or you will stretch the lungs in these patients, cause more inflammation, and kill them. There were 3 major papers published on that, all by these societies that address ventilator settings. So not understanding the inflammatory thrombotic response, not setting the ventilators properly, and you have hundreds of thousands to millions of people that are dead, and all because of a virus that was played with, knowingly played with. These papers, the stuff I showed earlier, these are statements directly from Barrick and Zhang Li and other individuals admitting that they played with the viruses, inserted HIV glycoprotein 120, caused other mutations in the HKU4 spike protein. And as we're going to see, there's a couple mutations that they haven't admitted to yet that are in the spike protein. So I think that's in one of the, it might be in the
So
next
what you're
slide.
saying is that basically the ventilators, due to misuse or deliberate misuse, were used to actually terminate the people being on those ventilators.
They gave them twice as much ventilatory tidal volume each time that they should have, which only caused more lung damage and killed people. So you can make as many ventilators as you want, but if you don't have the ventilator set properly, you kill people. I mean, that's what the research and published papers have shown. And what we saw was a scenario where it really felt like the medical community across the world, for whatever reason, wasn't getting on board with the right treatments, wasn't getting on board with the proper settings of the ventilators, And I have to tell you that when I see people breaking down and crying or saying this is not what they signed up for, this is exactly what we all signed up for. When I was in medical school, HIV hit the scene, brand new. I mean, when I began medical school, there was no such thing known as HIV. By the time I left medical school, we had hundreds that our team alone had taken care of. And I know for a fact that the numbers were misrepresented in the press because we would go home and listen to the news and they would talk about how many people were in the entire state. And we would look at each other as students and go, we've got more than that in the hospital. So, but,
Sorry, are you suggesting that mainstream media would somehow misrepresent the facts for some other agenda?
I'm just saying that they weren't representing the facts accurately. I'll let the listeners decide what they want to do.
Well,
with
next slide.
Yeah. So here you can see. I mean, this is just kind of the lineage of gain of function research from 2002 to 2019. And as you saw from the prior slides, the Department of Defense, National Institutes of Health, NIAID. Again, that is the National Institute of Allergies and Infectious Disease. If you don't know what that little Y is down below Fauci, that's supposed to be an antibody. Department of Health and Human Services, the FDA. Dr. Fauci is one of the major federal government sources of funding that has gone to Peter Daszak, which is immediately to his left, but center screen. And then Daszak gave it to Barrick and Zhang Li. And then if you look in the bottom left or bottom right corner, as I'm looking at it, that's the Wuhan Virology Institute, the only level 4 virology institute that I know of that's located inside a city. Because when you have agents that you believe are toxic that could kill people, you don't put it inside of a city where it can easily get out and infect people. And then up above that, that little tree-like looking structure is what the spike protein actually looks like. So that's what it looks like when the proteins that make up the spike protein are. And that little bend that you see there is a flexible part of that spike protein that allows the spike to move around and bend and find ACE2 receptors. So here you can see so why is a spike protein gain of function so important? Well, because it increases the infectivity and then the pathogenicity of the virus. And there's three that we know of. One is the HIV pseudovirus glycoprotein 120, which is interesting because the Australians shut down some of their vaccines when they discovered that people were testing positive for HIV. I'm not wondering so much why they tested for it, because I think that would be an intelligent thing to test for if you know that there's an HIV glycoprotein 120 attached. What I'm confused about is why nobody else is testing for it. One of the inserts that nobody's talking about or admitting to in their papers is the proline, arginine, alanine, or the PRRA. Now, those letters in the alphabet are just the accepted letters assigned to the different amino acids. So those are the 4 amino acids inserted. And that amino acid insert is found in no other coronavirus on planet Earth except this man-made spike protein. It is, however, found in rabies virus, it's found in HIV, and it's found in cobra toxin. And then at the very top, you'll see something called a prion-like domain. So with the insertion of the HIV glycoprotein 120 in the PRA insert, that has an effect on the rest of the spike protein. And one of the consequences is that at the top, near the at the receptor binding domain of the spike protein, the part of it that attaches to the ACE2 receptor, there is a prion-like domain, and we know that that prion-like domain has been associated with animal studies causing mice exposed to the spike protein. And remember, the spike protein is what's being coded for in the vaccines. That this spike protein crosses the blood-brain barrier exquisitely. In fact, it looks like it's well designed to cross the blood-brain barrier, and it produces amyloid deposits and Lewy bodies. We now know about a week and a half ago, a group of researchers showed that rhesus macaques, two different varieties, produced Lewy bodies in the brain when they were exposed to the spike protein, and this prion-like domain. Now, it also produces things like amyloidosis, which is of significance to a cardiologist like myself because of amyloid cardiomyopathies. But admittedly, its involvement in the brain is much more of a severe long-term sequelae and potentially short-term sequelae, as you've seen videos of people having all sorts of Parkinsonian and neurologic disorders. In fact, I want to mention somebody very important here, Dr. Kevin W. McCarran, who's a neurobiologist in Japan, who's originally from the UK, is probably one of the world's experts, if not the world expert, on rhesus macaques and these neurologic brain disorders. Kevin's one of the people that I've interacted in quite a bit, and he has been impressed that much of these antisocial behaviors that he saw in the violence last year in U.S. streets and other cities is exactly the type of animal behavior that happens to rhesus macaques and other animals when the limbic system is interfered with, which is one of the targets of this prion-like domain. And so there is real evidence showing that in humanized mice, that this prion-like domain produces spongiform encephalopathy, or what the general public refers to as mad cow disease, with the deaths of 95% of those mice occurring in 2 weeks, which is a year and a half for humans. And now the recent macaques paper that shows the Lewy bodies for Parkinsonian and other types of neurologic abnormalities showing up from the transmission of these spike proteins. And we know that these spike proteins that occur, and we also know that the vaccines, that when they are injected, do not stay at the site of injection, despite the claims that they do, because one of those pharmaceutical companies, Moderna, published a paper 2 to 3 years ago, maybe 4 now, looking at lipid nanoparticles following the injection into animal models, and the lipid nanoparticles were found all over the body, in the brain, the heart, the bone marrow, the lungs, the liver, and in the muscle where it was injected. So these lipid nanoparticles do not stick around at the site of injection. The vaccines not only produce, eventually result in the production of the spike protein, but the mRNA of the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines appear to reverse transcribe themselves into the DNA of humans. And Johnson & Johnson went one step further. Instead of making mRNA again of the spike protein, which is not even naturally occurring, to do their double-stranded DNA of their vaccine, they had to pop out the uracils in the mRNA and replace it with thymidine, and then put a complementary matching DNA there to make DNA. And the focal point of the Pfizer, or rather the Johnson & Johnson vaccine, is that that double-stranded DNA has to go into the human nucleus for it to then undergo transcription to produce mRNA, to then leave the nucleus through the nuclear protein core to get out to the ribosomes to translate into spike protein. And the spike proteins cross the blood-brain barrier exquisitely, as do the lipid nanoparticles.
Do you want that on the next slide?
Let's go to the next slide. Yes, please. So your original question to me about why anybody should listen to a cardiologist, particularly me, talk about a virus. other than the fact that, Flemings have a notorious history of being involved with infectious diseases.
Yeah, I think there's some other guy called Fleming discovered something. I'm not sure what it was.
Yeah, penicillin. And so, when I came and lectured in the QE2 conference center in London several years ago, it was the Fleming conference room from Sir Alexander Fleming. So, when I first presented the theory in '94, I certainly wasn't hoping that I was going to get it confirmed, which is essentially what SARS-CoV-2 does. But I also pointed out, as I show in this in that slide that we just had up there, that in the green activity that infectious disease at the very bottom in green was the #1 cause of humanity throughout the world prior to the discovery of penicillin. And then with the discovery of penicillin and the control of infections, then processing of foods and decreased physical activity, we developed these inflammatory inflammatory thrombotic response diseases like heart disease, obesity, diabetes, high blood pressure, cancer, strokes, the list goes on. But I also pointed out that I thought that eventually what would happen is that we would see infectious disease raise its ugly head again as the #1 cause of disease, this time through this inflammothrombotic process. And so you'll see number 11 is infectious disease. And if you look at the upper right-hand corner, actually in the entire right half of that diagram, which is in the textbook, shows the sequence about bacteria and viruses activating clotting, activating inflammation throughout the body, and the sequence of steps that actually occur that have to be treated if you're going to stop the inflammothrombotic response. So this was the chapter in the textbook in '99 that I published. Next slide, please. These are some nice examples of why people die with SARS-CoV-2. This is the inflammothrombotic response. So if you look in the left half of the scene, you'll see A and B shows lung parenchyma, or the outside of a lung tissue. C shows a blood clot in the lung itself, which is a pulmonary embolus, which means it's traveled from elsewhere in the body to impact itself into the lungs. And so part of the problem with oxygenation in the lungs is not only all the fluid that's accumulating from the inflammation, but the thrombosis or blood clot leading to an area that blocks the blood supply and prevents people from also picking up oxygen. And then D shows a deep venous thrombosis in the lower extremity that would eventually move up. What you see in the upper right-hand corner are examples of inflammatory cells building up within the lungs and other areas, and D in that upper right shows another blood clot, that round circular area. Straight below that is a prostate, believe it or not, and those black areas are blood clots forming in the prostate. And then in the bottom right-hand corner is the most important organ of the human body, which is the heart. And those purplish cells that you see the arrows pointing to are the inflammatory responses occurring in the heart as a result of the virus itself. So next slide, please. This is an example of the areas of the brain that have been shown to produce Lewy bodies with the spike protein crossing the brain. So you can see the areas are numbered from 1 through 15, showing the actual areas where they've now seen in the rhesus macaques the Lewy body formation following infection with the spike protein of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. The slides to the right show actual inflammatory cells, the brownish staining ones in A, or the CD3 plus T cells, which are inflammatory, and then the activated microglia, or the macrophages that occur in the brain, and those are stained brown. And then you see in the bottom right-hand corner that reddish dark area there. Those are Lewy bodies that have formed in the brains of monkeys within weeks of being exposed to the spike protein. Next slide, please. So with all of that said and done, and obvious that we had something that needed to be tested for, in January of last year, I began the process of looking at designing a study to determine what treatments work for SARS-CoV-2. what I did is I spent several months looking at mechanisms of action. Everybody else, well, not everybody else, a lot of people seem to have focused on whether we're treating people with an anti-malarial or an antibiotic, in contrast to looking at how those drugs work. And so it's, a classic example is that hydroxychloroquine is maybe an anti-malarial, but I don't really care. What I know is why. And it turns out that hydroxychloroquine, I'm sorry.
Sorry. Strangely, when you mentioned that particular phrase, your voice and everything stopped. I'm sure there's nothing to that. But if you wanted to repeat that, literally just everything stopped. So if you wanted to start again on that point.
Sure. I'll start over with looking at the different drugs. So at the beginning of January of 2020, I began looking at possible treatment regimens for SARS-CoV-2 and looked at a variety of different medications that looked like they might work. And my focus was to look at the mechanism of action, about why a drug works, instead of the classification of what a drug is. So a lot of people were focused on whether a drug was an anti-malarial or an antibiotic or a vitamin or a mineral. I was much more focused on why these things work. And so a classic example is hydroxychloroquine. Hydroxychloroquine works not because it's an anti-malarial and has been used for malaria. It works for a variety of mechanisms. It works by interfering with the attachment of SARS-CoV-2 to the ACE2 receptor. It works by enhancing the influx of zinc through what's called a zinc ionophore, or an ion passage, to allow the zinc to get into the cell to have an effect on inhibiting transcription or RNA-dependent RNA polymerase at the ribosome. Hydroxychloroquine works by slightly increasing the pH inside of a cell to impair the ability of the viral envelope to unfold, open up, and allow the genetic material out. It works by interfering with glycoprotein 2B3A, thereby interfering with blood clots. It works by downregulating the Toll-7 receptor, which is an inflammatory receptor. And I think there's another mechanism of action. So it's not the fact that it's an anti-malarial, it's how it works. The medications like azithromycin, was not used to prevent a secondary bacterial infection. It was used to actually interfere with the replication of the virus. And, part of the research that I wandered across was that azithromycin is supposedly only functional in bacterial cells because the size of the ribosomal subunits are different in bacteria than human cells. And so the companies that have made antibiotics that interfere with ribosomes have frequently said that it won't bother people because our ribosomes have the wrong subunits and they're different than bacteria. Well, it turns out that that's not true, because there was a very nice published study done with Zika showing that azithromycin interfered with the replication of the Zika virus in brain cells, in glial cells. So not only was that not exactly correct information from Big Pharma, but it also pointed to a mechanism of action for actual use with viruses. And so, and primaquine is another one that we used, and then clindamycin is another antibiotic that we used, but it was really selected because it interferes with the transcription, or the translation of the protein at the ribosome, and sorry about that. And it interferes with the TMPRSS2 receptor of the membrane to interfere with the attachment of the SARS-CoV-2 virus to the cells. So it actually turned out that clindamycin was, as you're going to see, extremely useful for the treatment of SARS-CoV-2. And then we looked at a variety of other medications. We looked at remdesivir. We looked at interferon alpha-2 beta. We looked at tocilizumab, which is an interleukin blocker. We looked at convalescent plasma, not as a first-line choice, but as a second-line choice. And I'm sure there's something else I don't remember. We were going to look at losartan, an angiotensin receptor blocker, but I decided against that. I wish we had looked at that. We did not look at ivermectin. Ivermectin wasn't on the radar screen at that point in time. So it took about 3 to 4 months for me to design the study and then put it up on the National Clinical Trial site. And then we selected, as you'll see in that slide that you had up, we selected 23 sites from 7 countries outside of the United States to actually look at the ability of these treatments. And so we ended up looking at 1,800 people, which to enter the study had to be PCR positive. And again, all that meant to us was that we knew that they had the virus in their nose or their throat. Initially, when they came in, they were seen by their physicians, and the physicians made a decision clinically as to whether, of the 1,800 people that came in, they all saw their physician initially. They got a PCR test. If the PCR test was positive, they were enrolled in the study. If the physician thought that they did not need to be treated, they were followed for 3 days and brought back. If the physician thought that they looked like they needed treatment, they clinically were appearing with elevated temperatures and myalgias or loss of smell or any of a variety of symptoms that, you know, you've all become familiar with, all the viral prodromes. Then they had the options of 4 treatment regimens that we used, each of which had an aminoquinoline in it. And then they were brought back in 3 days. And at the end of that 3-day period of time, the physicians then had to make a decision. Either the patient was better and could continue on whatever they were doing, whether it was no treatment or the aminoquinoline treatment, or if it looked like they were getting worse, then they were admitted to hospital. And of the 1,800, 501 of them got admitted to the hospital. And so we began in the first phase of the study with 10 different treatment regimens. And so they came in. We did a variety of tests, one of which included FMT-VDM, one of which included...
okay, I'll put you back up on screen. Yeah.
Okay. So of the 1,800, 501, we were shooting for 500. 501 got admitted to hospital, and once they came into the hospital, they immediately underwent FMT-VDM to measure the severity of SARS-CoV-2. At that point in time, they were presumed to have COVID-19, which meant that they were clinically presenting with significant enough symptoms to demonstrate that they had the disease now, as opposed to just having the virus. And I think that's an important distinction for people.
Could you explain that? That's a very important distinction, having the disease or the virus. What's the clinical differences in that?
Right. And if you read through the EUA of Johnson & Johnson, they murkied all of that together. So, you know, the vast majority of people, when they get a virus, get a viral infection. And the natural sequence occurs that at about 3 to 5 days, your immune system responds to that with what's called a T cell response, and that's called the innate acute T cell cytotoxic response, which is where your T cells are basically trying to kill off the virus in the cells that have been infected, and release chemicals that produce an inflammatory response to try to deal with that. And then about 7 to 10 days, which back up. That's why most people, when they get a viral infection, will feel lousy for about 4 or 5 days, and then they'll start to feel better because that T cell response is actually kicked in, and it's doing its job. That T cell response is present in all animal species, and that's why it's called the innate immune response. But in upper species, of which I'm glad to say humans are a part, or at least most humans are a part.
No.
You have what's called an adaptive humoral antibody response, and that occurs at about 7 to 10 days. And that is where the T cells have now presented the antigens to what's called the B cells, and antibodies are made. So for your listeners, T cells get their name because they originally start in the thymus gland, a gland in the center of the chest. B cells get their name because they're in fowl in birds, they come from the bursa, and in humans they come from bone. So T cell, B cell, um, and that makes the antibody response. And it's important to realize that it's not always a good thing to have an antibody response. And let's take a classic example here: strep pharyngitis or strep throat. So Streptococcus pneumoniae is present in the throat of every human being on planet Earth. So swabbing your throat to find out whether you have strep really doesn't help anybody. Although I understand a lot of people get it done. If you have white plaques, white areas on your tonsils, you have one of just a few things. If you swab it off and it bleeds, it's diphtheria. If you swab it off and it's yeasty, it's fungal. If you swab it off and it doesn't do either of those things, then it's probably strep. And so you don't really have to be a rocket scientist to figure this out. You have elevated temperature and cervical lymphadenopathy or swollen lymph nodes and white plaques in your throat, you have strep. Streptococcus pneumoniae in your throat, and you need to be treated. And the reason why you need to be treated with antibiotics, thank goodness for Fleming, is that penicillin, is that you want to kill the bacteria, but you also want to prevent the body from making antibodies. And the reason for that is that the antibodies that you make to Streptococcus pneumoniae or strep throat also recognize the valves of your heart as looking awfully similar. And so those antibodies will actually attack the mitral and aortic valves of your heart and produce something called rheumatic heart disease. And over time, that makes your valves stiffer, and eventually you have to have those valves replaced. And once you get those valves replaced, we have really kind of signed your death sentence, because those valves will only last so long. And so you're going to get one valve replaced, and you might luck out and get a second valve, but there's only so much tissue in the heart to sew into. And so that means you really, at maximum, going to get two valves replaced. And since they each last 10 to 15 years, you essentially then signed somebody's death certificate on how long they're going to live. Unless you give them a heart transplant, I guess. But conventionally, that's how that's done. And so that's why, just because you can make antibodies doesn't mean it's a good thing. And so just because you can make antibodies to SARS-CoV-2 or anything else doesn't necessarily mean it's a good thing. Just an important point for people to understand. So when these 501 people eventually got admitted to the hospital, they had an FMTVDM study, and they had ferritin, and they had interleukin-6 to look for inflammation, and they had a variety of other tests that were done. And we also looked at the QT corrected interval for prolongation to determine if there was a problem with a rhythm disturbance. And I think it's important to note that despite all the concerns about aminoquinolines like hydroxychloroquine and primaquine and chloroquine, that I'm yet to see a paper, and again, if your listeners can find one, I'd be happy to read it, where it has actually been shown that the use of these drugs have produced a heart rhythm problem in the patients taking it. And that was what all the fuss was about with hydroxychloroquine, that it was going to produce these heart rhythm disturbances. Well, the truth of the matter is that there's not a single paper that I've read, seen, or heard about that has shown ventricular polymorphic dysrhythmia, or tachydysrhythmias, or torsade de pois, which are the two rhythms that would occur with QT prolongation. So despite all the press and media attention to this, I'm yet to see a case where it's been an issue. And in our study, we also included calcium and magnesium being given to everybody, and made it available for IV esmolol to be used, which is a medication that will slow down the heart rate. And one of the consequences is that it shortens QT intervals. So I think most patients are aware that when physicians prescribe medications for people, there are potential complications and side effects. And one of the questions that we ask is, how beneficial is the drug, and how serious is the side effect? And clearly the treatment of this virus is not meant for 6 to 12 months. I mean, this is something that's a week or two. done properly, and so you're not using it long term. And so I think we could all suffer along if we had to have IV esmolol for a week or two just to allow us to continue with medications that are interfering with the virus. That being said, it wasn't necessary in any of the 501 people that were admitted to hospital. It's also true that the inflammation produced with the infection can prolong the QT. So seeing the QT prolong in these patients doesn't mean it's the hydroxychloroquine one. I mean, it could just simply be the infection and the inflammatory thrombotic response itself. So is it the chicken or the egg? Is it the infection or the treatment? And that's why you have physicians that are supposed to be in charge of this, that take care of the patients and make clinical decision-making skills. And I would argue not people that are in charge of medical boards or in charge of government agencies telling physicians which drugs they can use, because the practice of medicine has always been that once the FDA approves a drug for a treatment, physicians use the clinical skills and expertise to determine if a drug can be used for what's called off-label purposes, as long as patients sign informed consents, something that's not being done for the experimental vaccines.
Are you saying that maybe politicians and corporate bodies are playing politics with people's lives?
Yeah, what I'm saying is that the interference from all of these individuals with physicians practicing medicine has not only confused medicine itself and scared physicians from using treatments, but they're interfering with the practice of medicine, and frankly, they're practicing medicine without a license.
Oh, I think that maybe that's an opportunity to go to the next slide.
Yes. So the next slide actually shows what it looked like. This is to the far left. This is what FMTVDM looks like. Now, the actual slide that you're seeing there was one that we published earlier that demonstrates that Gompers and Laird, two different oncologists, back some 60, 70 years ago now, had proposed that the process of cells changing from normal to cancer went through a series of steps, going through an inflammatory process to precancerous to cancerous stages was a quadratic function. I'd like to take credit for the fact that they proposed that, but that would be wrong because they proposed it. I can take credit for the fact, I guess, that we proved it with FMTVDM, because you can see what is a quadratic sigmoidal curve here, confirming that they were, Gompers and Laird were both correct on that. But if you look at the range between 150 and roughly 250, you'll see an area called inflammatory and thrombosis and infection, and that is exactly what we see with SARS-CoV-2. So the center part looks at a lady, female patient, 3/1, which means she came from the third study site. She was the first patient. She entered phase 1 of the study treatment. And I should explain that phase 1 is where we started with a single treatment, and every 3 days, modified treatment based upon the outcome of FMTVDM, ferritin, and interleukin-6. And so if people got better significantly, by definition would be an FMTVDM drop of 25 or more, they were kept on that treatment. If they got worse, which was an FMTVDM increase of more than 25, the first drug would be stopped and a second one would be randomly assigned. So everybody got randomly assigned which drugs they got. And then if they were somewhere in between there, they didn't really show improvement or deterioration, we took the position that there might be some benefit, but then we randomly added a second one. And so what this meant was that with 10 drug combinations that got layered, we were able to see the outcomes of 52 different drug treatment combinations. In this lady's case, she entered phase 1 after failing treatment 1 as an outpatient, which was hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin. And she came in, her initial FMTVDM was 195, so greater than 150 is elevated. Ferritin was 302 nanograms per milliliter, and that's elevated. And then interleukin-6 at 45 was elevated, and she randomly had added to her treatment regimen, treatment number 8, which was methylprednisolone, and 3 days later had the studies repeated, and you can see that the FMTVDM value improved to 170, which is exactly 25. Ferritin improved, but still not normal. Interleukin-6 improved, but still not normal. So she was kept on this, and in fact, This was one of the three drug treatment regimens that we concluded was effective in 99.83% of the patients that were hospitalized. So you had asked me earlier to comment on something. SARS-CoV-2 is an infection. And your body typically will respond to a viral infection, and you have aches and pains and an elevated temperature as your body tries to kill off the virus and the cells infected with heat and respond to it. And that is a viral infection. But when that viral infection starts to have an inflammothrombotic response, it's gotten out of control for a variety of reasons. Now you have the disease. Well, who has the disease in SARS-CoV-2? The people that have immune systems that are out of balance. Now, who are those? They're either the immune naive people, the children who do not have a finely tuned inflammatory system, and they're now calling that a multi-system inflammatory disease, but it's really they have an immune naive system producing inflammothrombotic response. Or diabetics. Or you have people with comorbidities. They have these hyperinflammatory states. They have diabetes or heart disease or advanced age or high blood pressure or strokes or cancer. So their immune system is already activated at an increased level of inflammation because they already have these underlying diseases. Now you throw on to that SARS-CoV-2, which antagonizes the system as noted in the theory that I first presented, and you have an increased potential for inflammation and blood clotting. And without treatment of that inflammation and blood clotting, people die. So that's the disease part of it. So you have to separate, or I would argue, you need to separate conceptually the difference between having the virus and having the disease. It's kind of like having high cholesterol and having heart disease. You can have high cholesterol and it's not good for you. It's clearly a problem. I mean, nobody has ever done a study that shows that high cholesterol is good for anybody. However, once it starts to produce the inflammation and thrombosis in the blood vessels, now you have coronary artery disease. So there's a difference between things that can produce a problem and the actual problem itself. And you have to address those intelligently and separately. Next slide, please. As a result of those 52 treatment combinations, what we then did is started phase 2, where we brought people in and just started with the drug combinations, which shouldn't be a big surprise because HIV, as a classic virus for treatment, requires multiple drugs to treat the problem. In the outpatient setting, we saw there were 4 different treatment combinations that we allowed people to have. 100% of the people who were PCR positive, whose physicians saw them and said, you're symptomatic, we need to do treatment, we need to get on top of this. 100% of the patients who got a primaquine, clindamycin, hydroxychloroquine combination got better. 100%. 97.9% of the people that were on hydroxychloroquine and clindamycin combination got better. 74.2% got better if they were on hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, 69.1% of hydroxychloroquine and doxycycline. Now, if you average those numbers out, they come out to about 83%. And amazingly enough, when you look at other people that are talking about using hydroxychloroquine or aminoclinolins in the outpatient setting, 83% is what they're coming up with across the board, whether it's Zelenko or McCullough or the people in Italy or just anywhere in India. You know, when you look at the papers that are being published, or at least the preprints, because there's a huge effort to block this research from getting published. I mean, I literally sent this paper, which is 12,000 words. And for your listeners, a typical scientific research paper is 3,000 to 4,000 words. Has a couple figures, couple tables. This had over 12,000 words, 12 tables, 8 figures. There simply wasn't any other way to do this. Most of the clinical trials that are done look at one drug, remdesivir. And in our research, if the patient did not get an aminoquinolin first and they got started in remdesivir, it only worked 28% of the time, which is less than chance. Because if you can get better, worse, or stay the same, that's a 1/3, 1/3, 1/3, 33 1/3. And 28% is how you perform. That's underperforming chance, 1/3. So I'm really unimpressed with remdesivir, but clearly other people found a way to get it to be used. And for the people that it works for, I'm delighted. In fact, one of the interesting things in the study is that remdesivir, for some reason, I have no idea why, I think it would be interesting to look at. The people in Belgium that got remdesivir did better than anywhere else. So I presume there's some genetic something going on there, which I think would be fascinating because I think it would be useful to know, number one. And number two, I think it would be helpful for remdesivir, for that company to know what it is that targets it, because it's the better you can target a drug and the more effective it is, the better it is for everybody, the drug company, the patients, everybody. So
Well, maybe
okay,
it's the
next slide.
beer or the chocolate.
Well, being Fleming, I would agree with probably that.
Just sort of lighten the load here.
Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, no, I get it. If you want really good chocolate, get it from Belgium. Yeah. What is that? The food, British food is, I forgot the expression for it, but it's certainly not,
Well, apart from the roast beef, it's almost a contradiction in terms, and we're in enough trouble already. So we'll just
There
okay.
you go.
The next
There you go.
slide. Yeah.
Well, I have had some good roast beef in London.
Roast beef.
And then for the inpatients, what we saw and was an interesting phenomenon. Even in the people that seem to need to be admitted after having an aminoquinolin, it somehow seems to prime the system. Whether, and again, I don't know, but it somehow seemed to prime it, because if they received an aminoquinolin as an outpatient, they responded almost immediately either with the administration of methylprednisolone or the administration of tocilizumab and interferon alpha 2 beta. And I don't think people would be too hard pressed to jog their memories to try to think of a public figure that admitted to taking hydroxychloroquine before getting sick, and then when he went into the hospital within 36 hours had responded to methylprednisolone.
You wouldn't be talking about a prime minister of a certain country, would you?
Well, President Trump is who I'm thinking about. But if
Boris,
there's a did he also get that?
I think he got something similar. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean it's extremely useful combination. And if they didn't get an aminoquinolin as an outpatient, what we discovered was the combination of primaquine, clindamycin, tocilizumab, and interferon alpha 2 beta was hugely successful. What we saw over the course of this study was that hospital times reduced from 4 to 6 weeks, sometimes 8 weeks, down to 1 to 2 weeks. The number of people that were put on ventilators was substantially reduced. We lost 3 people out of 1,800. All 3 of them were on ventilators. All 3 died within 5 days.
And do you think that may have been improper use of the ventilators?
I would like to think not, because we, as part of the protocol for how to use the ventilators, we had set it at 5 milliliters per kilogram body weight. So, they were supposed to be following that. And again, we lost 2 in the first phase, which is where we were doing layering, and 1 in phase 2. No death is ever welcome. It's easy to say people were going to die. Some people were going to do that anyway, but it's never felt good for me to lose a patient under any set of circumstances.
Okay, well, we'll get on with the next slide.
Yep. So you should also know that everybody also received the following. They received immune support, which included B6 vitamins, B6, B12, B9. They got magnesium, calcium. They got dehydroepiandrosterone. They got vitamin C. They got zinc, and they got 125 dihydroxycholecalciferol or vitamin D. The other thing is that everybody that I've ever met in my life who came into a hospital who had a respiratory problem got breathing treatments. They got nebulizers or inhalers to relax their airways so they could breathe better. So everybody here had Atrovent, and for the life of me, I have no idea why people are not getting that across the board. We would do that for any other respiratory problem in the world. Why is it not being done for these patients? And then they all, they all got heparin subcutaneously, because way back when I was a medical student in the dark ages, in the early 80s, we learned to put everybody on sub-Q heparin, 5,000 units sub-Q to Q12 hours, to reduce the potential for forming a blood clot if they were going to be in bed. Well, the common denominator for all these patients coming to the hospital, other than the fact that they're being isolated from family members, which boggles my mind, is that they're all in bed rest. They're not being moved around. So if you want somebody to form a blood clot, that's a great way to do it. And these people are dying from blood clots. So again, it just boggles my mind that this is not being done across the board. And I'm going to make my statement here about hospitalized patients, that there is no good reason for these patients to not have their family members in there. I mean, if you want to put them in a spacesuit, PPE, to visit their family members, I will tell you as a physician that people have gotten better, not because of the care I've given them, but because of the fact that they had family members that were there with them. And I say that because there have been times that I've taken care of patients that they have made recoveries that I can only look at people and go, well, I did everything I could think of, but I'm not convinced it was me. I'm thinking it might have been the fact that they wanted to live, because of their family members
and loving care,
and loving care, and frankly, I, as compassionate and concerned as I am about my patients, I can't give to a patient what the people that means most to them do. Personal story, my father, when he had his bypass operation, I remember this. He, I was a medical student, and he ended up needing a bypass operation. We got him scheduled, and I came back, and my then wife was pregnant with our first child. And my father, several hours after they completed surgery, was still on the ventilator, still unconscious. Well past the time he should have woken up. And people were worried. And I was there with my dad and talking with him. And I leaned over and I gave my dad a kiss. And I said, "This is from Stephanie." And he knew the name of his unborn granddaughter. And my father's eyes flashed wide open. And he almost sat straight up in bed. It's like, okay. Not me. It wasn't me being around, but knowing that his granddaughter would be waiting for him, that his unborn granddaughter, was what it took for my father to come out of his coma. You can't bottle that, you can't sell that, you can't prescribe that, and you can't give it other than from the people that have it to give.
A reason to live, a reason to look forward to something.
Oh, absolutely. And frankly, we need the family members in the hospital giving that to the patients. So,
okay, well, the next slide.
So one of the key determinants that a research paper is valid is more than just simply getting published, because yes, that's a lot of hurdles to get through, and I review for something like 16 or 17 journals, 2 of which I resigned from during 2020 due to ethical concerns. I resigned from British Medical Journal Open Quality, and I resigned from The Lancet because of their roles in this entire fiasco with SARS-CoV-2, and particularly after Peter Daszak published with a series of other people in the Lancet that this virus was a zoonotic or naturally occurring way back at the beginning of 2020. That's not the function of a scientific or medical journal, and so I resigned from both of those journals. Which are prestigious journals, but they no longer are in my view. And
are you saying they've been bought?
They certainly act like they have. The New England Journal of Medicine to allow Bill Gates to publish editorials in a New England. I mean, Bill Gates may have a lot to know about computer viruses, but he knows nothing about human viruses. And if he does, then I'm concerned about why he would know something about human viruses, because he's a computer guru. He's not a physician and he's not a scientist. So the fact that the New England Journal of Medicine allows him to write editorials is mind-boggling, and it takes the credibility out of the New England Journal of Medicine as far as I'm concerned. So,
well, I've never heard a sponsor or a financier of a media network to influence the content of the periodical or broadcast.
Yeah, it's unacceptable, it's unscientific, and it does disservice to those journals. So I resigned from those two. Anyway,
okay.
So to get it published is quite a thing, but it's important that other people be able to produce similar results. And so, here's just a few of the people. I mean, Dr. Zelenko, who was one of the people who made President Trump aware of hydroxychloroquine. He's reporting an 84% reduction in hospitalizations, back there in those numbers that I was showing as outpatients. Dr. McCullough and a variety of other people accumulated 9 different studies looking at hydroxychloroquine and other studies, and showed a 60% reduction in death. The Association of American Physicians and Surgeons have shown similar results on their websites. Dr. Reich from Yale University showed hydroxychloroquine produced a 34% reduction in the risk of death. So you can flip that around with 66% improvement. And kudos to the Yale School of Medicine dean, Dr. Verman, for responding to criticisms when they were going after Dr. Risch by stating that, it's not the function of a dean to criticize physicians who are doing research and investigating to try and find answers. I mean, if you have a problem, then you need to submit your letters to the editor or other mechanisms to give your alternative viewpoints. But you don't, there's this big thing out there right now for all people trying to retract papers based upon the fact that they don't like what's published in the papers, as opposed to whether it's scientifically invalid. And that doesn't do the scientific or medical community any good. In fact, there's a huge benefit to having papers that show no benefit in published research, because part of the job of a researcher, of a scientist, is to go see what's been published in a field. And if you can find papers that show that something doesn't work, that's as important as finding that something does work, because it guides you to your research. Back to that slide, please.
Is that not because of the fourth law of thermodynamics?
The fourth one?
The fourth law, yeah. Thou shalt not lose thy funding.
Yeah. Well, the physicist was only aware of the first three. Yeah, do not lose thy funding. Dr. Bartlett, again, he was talking about nasal steroids being 100% successful. And then Dr. Italia, looking at the impact and long-term care facilities and the benefit of anticoagulants, producing an 84% reduction in people less likely to die. So the more you look at the literature from people that are trying to independently find answers for this, the more you see these consistencies. And unless you are going to say that everybody is now talking with everybody and saying, well, what are you getting for numbers so I can write something similar? And I'm sure that there are probably people out there who would entertain that as a justification for them not agreeing with the results. Then you have to ask the question, why are these numbers coming up so consistent across the board from people who don't know each other? And some of us are now obviously beginning to learn about each other and raise questions. But Consistency of results from one place to another is the hallmark of valid scientific data. Next slide, please. This is this is a diagram that we have on FlemingMethod.com. It's already out of date because it addresses the difference between a respiratory viral pathogen requiring an ACE2 receptor, as you can see in the center there, getting into the cells and then undergoing replication and inflammothrombotic responses, to looking at the Pfizer and Moderna lipid nanoparticles, number 2. And if you do the mathematics of it based upon the weight, those vaccines contain about 13 billion mRNAs that merge with the cell receptors. So gain of function is actually alteration of the virus to increase its infectivity and pathogenicity. So the PRRA insert is one mode. The HIV glycoprotein is another. The prion-like domain has become another, and the lipid nanoparticle in the vaccines are actually another form of enhanced gain of function, because they no longer are dependent upon ACE receptors to enter the cell. They either merge as a lipid nanoparticle, which we know travel around the body, infecting all parts of the body, the brain, the liver, the lungs, the heart, the bone marrow, thanks to Moderna's study with influenza lipid nanoparticle vaccines. We know that those spike proteins get into the brain and produce those prion-like diseases, and do so through neuropilin-1, and also interfere with the recognition of the level of hypoxia, or just how poor somebody's oxygen level is as a result of this infection. And then Johnson & Johnson, which you don't see the adenovirus added on here, but it is a virus that, used to be considered deadly, that they came up with vaccines for. The adenovirus is grown on retinal tissue from it was originally an 18-month-old aborted fetus retinal tissue, but it's the adenovirus is grown on that. And then supposedly, if we believe Johnson & Johnson, is unable to replicate itself, but has been inserted with double-stranded DNA. So again, they've gone beyond altering the spike protein to now providing the genetic sequence as mRNA for the spike protein, to now replacing the uracils on the mRNA, inserting thymidine to make DNA, a single strand, and then complementing it with the additional one to put inside the adenovirus so it can infect cells and go straight to the nucleus, where it will then start the process going back out. So we know that the Pfizer vaccine actually inserts itself into the human DNA. And if we go back to that slide, you can see that the Pfizer and Moderna vaccines, the mRNA has been shown to insert itself into the DNA. In that bottom right corner, you'll see what looks like red haloing a blue area. That blue area is DNA of a human cell, and the mRNA is colored in red, and you can see that red dot inside showing that the mRNA of the SARS-CoV-2 virus has actually entered the nucleus. So
now that's a very detailed diagram that's available from your website, I understand.
Correct. And
your website is?
FlemingMethod.com.
Okay.
And so that's a very important thing, because what makes HIV so unique is that it has this reverse transcriptase ability. So when DNA gets turned into mRNA, that's called transcription. And when you take RNA and send it back into DNA, that's called reverse transcription. And the enzymes that do that are called reverse transcriptase. So we used to think that HIV was really the first one to teach us this ability. We now know that, thanks to the Human Genome Project, that the long interspersed nuclear elements of human DNA, about 17% of our DNA has this reverse transcriptase capability. In cardiology, we've known for some time that platelets that are involved in blood clotting have this reverse transcriptase capability. So if you give it the right viral or genetic material, it will reverse transcribe it. We also know that CD4 helper cells have this capability, which is how HIV infected CD4 helper cells and would lay dormant for a while and then re-expose itself. And part of what we're seeing with the people with SARS-CoV-2 is about 1 in 3 patients are coming back in about 5 months, with about 1 in 8 of those patients dying. And so they will get better, they will get over it. But because they're actually not being treated for either the infection, the attachment, or the replication, and they're not being treated for the inflammothrombotic response, what's happened is that the virus goes dormant and then re-expresses itself. So sometimes when the media has been talking about somebody gets a second infection, the question really becomes more of, did they get another infection from somebody else, or is this simply the dormant virus now re-expressing itself? And viruses do this over and over again if they're not properly treated. Herpes zoster, or shingles, that most people are aware of, is nothing more than a re-expression of the varicella virus, or the chickenpox virus. So you get chickenpox usually when you're younger. Your body deals with it, and then the virus lays dormant in what's called the dorsal ganglia, which or neurologic connections between the central and peripheral nervous system that run both sides of your spinal column, and they lay dormant there. And then when you're immune suppressed for some reason, you're ill, you get diabetes, you're getting chemotherapy, a variety of things, then the virus can re-express itself and it comes back along the nerve roots, and that's why you see it line up on the skin on patterns, because it runs along the sensory network of that peripheral nerve, and it re-expresses itself, and then you treat it and it goes back into a dormant state. So this is not a new phenomenon, and the problem is that you have to treat it. And so we're going to see long-term sequelae long after this. But the problem with all this is that people are not getting the types of treatments they should be getting. The vaccines themselves do not prevent you from getting an infection. They do not prevent you from spreading an infection. They prime your immune system in the same way that getting the infection naturally would do, except it's overwhelming your immune system, so that what we're seeing is that normally the people who had problems were the people in those two extremes, the immune naive or the hyperthrombotic ones. Those are the people that were presenting with the disease and the symptoms. Now what we're seeing are individuals in their 20s, 30s, 40s, and 50s having the symptoms. And you're seeing an overwhelmed immune system now receiving billions of messenger RNA or DNA to make spike protein, and they're responding appropriately. So all of this, SARS-CoV-2, raises a number of serious moral, ethical, and scientific concerns. There's no way around this. This gain-of-function research and the release of SARS-CoV-2, it no longer matters whether the release was intentional or accidental. They're culpable. They're criminally culpable. The interference with physicians treating patients so that we can stop people from dying, so that we can minimize the long-term sequelae by getting the infection and the inflammothrombotic response under control. I'm dumbfounded by the vaccines. I guess I may be the only one who remembers swine flu vaccines. I was an orderly. I took care of Guillain-Barré, this neurologic abnormalities in the hospital before going to medical school for people who had the swine flu vaccine. That was the last great rushed vaccine that I'm aware of with a neurologic sequelae. It's unconscionable. This is experimental. The fact that physicians are not standing there at the testing sites for swabbing for PCR. Physicians are not standing there at the vaccine sites. Informed consent is not happening. Nazi Germany didn't do this to people across the board. They didn't experiment on their entire population. This is an experiment on the entire populace of the United States, of the UK, of every country who is going along with this and promoting this. And, there's a cute joke that I heard, a little bit of brevity. Two rats are looking at each other, and the one rat says, "Are you going to get the vaccine?" And the second rat looks at the first one and says, "They haven't finished the human trials yet."
Ooh,
Okay.
that's a good one. That's a good one. My God. A bit of a joke. Yeah, we need some of this. Okay, we're now going on to the next slide, and we've been running for about 2 hours. So
sorry about that.
Okay, no, that's perfect. That's fine.
Let's go back to that last slide briefly, because there was a fourth thing I think that I had there.
Okay.
Apologies. Oh, and we hit it. Vaccination treatment without informed consent. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Informed consent. It's a requirement. We would, I mean, it is unconscionable that you would not have people signed informed consent. I don't know where the lawyers are on this one, but guys,
well, they've been bought off, haven't they?
I don't know. Is somebody needs to step forward and insist upon this. You know, the legal system is always all over doctors about informed consent and anything else that they can be taken to task with. And you know, if you're a good attorney and you're really worried about the people, please get out there and start making sure that people are taken care of. Back to the Department of Defense, National Institutes of Allergies and Infectious Diseases, NIH, every one of these government agencies, this is a biological weapon. This is a violation of the Biological Weapons Convention Treaty. If any nation, if the United States knew that any other nation was responsible for launching a biological weapon, we would have them in international court in record time. There's no peaceful or prophylactic purpose behind this under all circumstances. So the final declaration document concluded that under all circumstances, the use of biological and toxic weapons is effectively prohibited by the convention, and affirms the determination of states parties to condemn any use of biological agents or weapons or toxins other than for peaceful purposes by anyone at any time. And I'm pretty certain that includes all of the people that we've already talked about. Next slide, please. It is a violation of the 1947 Nuremberg Code, where you know, after Nazi Germany, we sat down and we said you cannot experiment on human beings. There is a right way and a wrong way to conduct medical and scientific research. One provision, number 3, is based upon the results of animal experimentation. You know, that was just almost completely circumvented. I'm only aware of a few studies, and those are studies by people that were trying to investigate on their own, not by the powers that be, trying to do a thorough job to determine the consequences and the harm and the benefit that might occur for treatments and vaccines. Next slide, please. It's a violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. Article 7 says that in particular, no one shall be subjected without his free consent to medical or scientific experimentation. Eleanor Roosevelt pushed to get the ICCPR treaty signed, and of which the United States is a signatory and ratifier of, which was pushed into the UN after Nazi Germany to make sure that experiments that were done by people like Mengele were never done again in human history. Next slide, please. And it is a violation, a clear violation of the Code of Ethics of the American Medical Association. Informed consent requires a patient and a physician, and it requires that patients be made aware of the reason why they're undergoing testing or treatment, the risks and the benefits of that. Not doing that is a violation of the AMA Code of Medical Ethics. Next slide, please. So what I'm calling for are 4 basic fundamental things. 1, the immediate cessation of any gain-of-function research. Any gain-of-function research that may be applicable or useful in the future requires physicians and scientists to determine what the limitations and controls of that research must be. What has been demonstrated is that the US has funded, and apparently the UK has funded, and I've heard Israel has funded, and China has been a part of gain-of-function research done that has placed at risk the entire planet, by a pandemic with the consequences that we've all lived with for more than a year. This gain of function research must cease effective immediately. 2, that physicians be allowed to practice medicine and provide to their patients treatments that work, either based upon published data like my work or preprint work from the people that I mentioned in earlier slides, as long as informed consent is provided. Patients and physicians decide that treatment, not governments, not government officials, not courts, not bureaucrats. Physicians and patients. Number 3, the immediate cessation of experimental vaccines, and that's what these are. The vaccines are being judged based upon whether they change PCR levels or whether someone gets the disease. The evaluation of these vaccines should be whether they produce T-cell and antibody responses to shorten the duration. There's no data being published on T-cell or antibody responses, no antibody titers, no mention of IgA, and not much T-cell information being provided. The immediate cessation of these vaccines until it can be proven whether they're safe and effective. And by the way, emergency use authorization, the 4th requirement for EUAs to exist is that there is no proven medical treatment effective for the disease, raising the serious question as to why so much effort has been placed to block treatments from being received by patients for doctors and patients who want to try those treatments. It is, not to beat a dead horse here, unconscionable that any government agency would put such an effort to block treatments and push for vaccines which are not treatments. There are more than 500,000 dead Americans as a result of SARS-CoV-2. Put into perspective, it's more people than died in all the military people who died in World War II, more than all the soldiers who died in America's bloodiest war, the Civil War, and more than all these American soldiers that died in all of our other wars together. This is a biological weapon. The ramifications in death toll are shown against these military campaigns. It dwarfs what's gone on in any other of the 2 major wars that we had and all the other wars combined. Next slide, please. Because of that, I'm also calling for the immediate investigation and prosecution of those individuals involved in the gain of function research and the release of this virus. Their intentional, knowing, and reckless actions meet the definition of crimes against humanity, and they should be held accountable in international, national, and state tribunals for crimes against humanity. Nothing less will stop them from continuing the behaviors that they've already demonstrated that they're not only able to do, willing to do, but continuing to do. Next slide, please. This is what SARS-CoV-2 looks like, and I will send you the video so you can show it. Of the slide on the right shows it goes up and down, and you can see the actual SARS-CoV-2 virus with its spike proteins in its corona shape. I'll send that to you so you can play that. It's incredibly important because there are people out there that are actually of the opinion that SARS-CoV-2 doesn't exist and has not been isolated. These individuals not only have demonstrated they don't understand viruses, but they interfere with the serious discussion going on with this virus. Because as long as there are people that believe that the virus doesn't exist, then the powers that be that have actually gain of functioned this virus can shoot down anybody else coming up with credible concerns, because it places the people with serious concerns on the opposite side of the debate. And when part of the people on the opposite side of the debate are people that don't even understand that
Dr. Fleming, we've lost you again, but if you can hear me, we're just going to, that was a major statement you were saying there. And just while we pick up the data rate, Apologies for a couple of
Right.
notifications coming in there. I can't stop. But I had a very important. We've been blocked here. Who is they?
They are the people like Dr. Andrew Kaufman and Cowan and people like that who believe that germ theory doesn't exist and that terrain theory is the thing. Well, terrain theory was destroyed a long time ago. It's nice to use the term terrain, the lay of the land, because the immune response is part of the terrain, but just because you use that term doesn't mean that you're using it correctly. They would like to believe that exosomes are the actual virus. But these same types of people, when SARS-CoV-2, when COVID-19 was discussed, they thought that COVID-19 was the 19th coronavirus. They thought that the spike protein was actually the virus itself. They don't understand virology. So the people that are promulgating the idea that viruses don't exist interfere with the serious discussion trying to deal with people that have actually gain of functioned this virus, which has produced this pandemic. So it's very important that people understand that viruses are real. They've been cultured. That's how we know that they're mutating. We can see the change in the genetic code. And the important thing here is that viruses naturally do not get more virulent as they mutate and change, because a virus needs living hosts to survive. So if the virus becomes more virulent, more nasty, more pathogenic, and kills the host, then the virus dies and it won't be passed on. So when you look at something that's happening right now, we're seeing an increased virulence or nastiness, pathogenicity to this virus. And you have to ask yourself where it's coming from. And it's not occurring naturally any more than the original spike protein did. So given the fact that they haven't been honest with us, given the fact that if you look at when these variants occur, they're occurring after vaccinations are beginning in those areas. It raises a serious question about whether these variants that we're seeing that are nastier are actually part of the vaccines that are being used around the world. Is this the source of these variants? Because this would be the first time in history where a virus is getting more infective and more pathogenic, which would be its undoing if it did that. If it kills the host, it's dead. It won't continue to transmit itself.
One of the crucial things I wanted to ask was, do you think what you've just spoken about is controlled opposition?
I try not to get into anything non-scientific. I think the importance of my position is to say, as the scientist physician, and to provide that. What I find challenging is the response of the medical journals to all the research papers that are presenting treatment information that goes counter to the narrative being promulgated by, for lack of a better term, the system, the establishment. That raises serious questions for me. What I saw last year in the United States was a polarization of people. And I'm sure this is what was going on around the world, that people really divided themselves up into two separate camps. Those who claim that they were following the science, and those who were concerned about the loss of social freedoms. And I really think that those two need to mesh together. The people that are wearing masks and worried about people who aren't wearing masks are doing so, I think, because they have been scared to the place where they literally believe that their lives and the lives of the people they care about are at risk if they don't wear the masks. And understanding that is important, because rather than having a conversation with people and saying, well, that's just silly or wrong for whatever reason, if you can empathize and understand why another person is thinking about this the way they are, it's easier to come to terms. It's easier to have an intelligent, informed discussion. And as long as we have two essentially polarized groups, we're not having these discussions. It is, and it's interfered with people understanding that there are treatments for this. It's interfered with people understanding that this virus is gain of function produced. It's interfered because a lot of people want to trust, for lack of a better term, the establishment. So I was born in 1956. So I was raised during the Vietnam era and all the stuff that went on with that and all the terms, the establishment system. So I try not to overuse those terms. But when you see the central theme pushing something and pushing so hard and pushing back against anybody else who presents an idea like treatments or other approaches, that raises red flags in my mind as a scientist, because in science, one of the fundamental things is that if something is not understood, then there has to be something wrong with the fundamental approach or theorem. You know, it's like cholesterol or the redistribution of these isotopes. It's not until you step back and go, well, wait a minute, maybe we're missing something, and what does somebody else have to say on this, that you start to understand things as being different. You can't get to that level of understanding if your attitude is you are wrong. There are no treatments. Hydroxychloroquine cannot work because it cannot work. And when you're a scientist like Dr. Fauci and you say hydroxychloroquine works for SARS-CoV-1, but then SARS-CoV-2 comes across and you go, no, it doesn't work. You have to wonder what's going on scientifically and objectively. So for a lot of people, I think they're following misinformation, and I can't speak to the motives of the people that are providing that misinformation. All I can do is say it's misinformation, because the research data shows these treatments do work. The research data has not provided T-cell or antibody responses to the vaccine. The research data has not shown that the vaccines prevent you from getting the virus or spreading the virus. The paper trail shows that this virus is man-made with gain-of-function research and paid for heavily by U.S. tax dollars. The science doesn't lie if you're objective and you're willing to look at it. And what happens is that whenever people get into a position that they're unwilling to look at what somebody else is saying, they pose a threat to themselves of not understanding the truth. I've always told people, if you can come up to me on anything that I've published, my theory, whatever, and come up with a credible argument for why there's something wrong or maybe should be changed, I will change my mind if it's credible. That doesn't mean you get to come up to me with something that isn't credible and go, well, you said if I came up to you with something, you'd accept it. No, it has to be credible. It has to be intelligent. But, you know, that's how we make scientific advances. I mean, Semmelweis told people that you need to wash your hands to decrease infant mortality. Hubble told people that the universe was expanding. Einstein explained the effects of gravity in both special and general relativity theory. Fleming described the inflammatory process and the role of viruses and bacteria. Many people have been treating SARS-CoV-2 successfully with a variety of drugs, some of which I haven't looked at, ivermectin, for example. And I can't say that I can say that ivermectin works, but what I can say is they certainly believe it does, and they are providing scientific data to support it. So you have to look at that credibly. Hopefully that answered that question.
Well, we have an awful lot of books and things drawing to a close here that you've got more information from both medical professionals.
Yeah, there's a ton of things on Amazon.com that includes things about the viruses, includes things about nuclear imaging and echocardiography and pacemakers and electrocardiograms. And vaccines. You can see Operation Warp Speed. Mirror talks about some of the wonderful experiences I've had in my life with Big Pharma and the courts, and just some generally good information for people. And then some of the prior books on how to bypass your bypass and the diet myth and stop inflammation now. The Heart Healthy program was over in the UK. That's the equivalent of Stop Inflammation Now, but those are all available on Amazon.com, and hopefully we'll give more information and insight for people, so they can kind of sit down and go over it. One of the benefits of the books is that sometimes you read something and you're not quite certain, but if you read through it several times, it starts to make more and more sense. That's the benefit of a book. And the other thing is that even if you don't completely understand it, knowing that there's a real science behind it can go a long way for you to go, well, it's not just an opinion, it's not just somebody's idea, there's science behind it. And one of the big things that I'm in favor of is science. And it's a challenge right now, because I realize that SARS-CoV-2 was probably the least thing that the general public was prepared to take on, which was a virus. And really what that is, it's not the simplest of biological things to understand. I mean, it's for the general public, but it's a very intelligently organized system that doesn't waste its energy having the reproductive machinery within itself. It uses a host to do that. And because of that, that gives us ways to actually target and treat it, which we can and should be doing.
Well, sir, those books, of course, can be obtained from Devices Books here in Devices, who have a wonderful bookshop. Handel Bookshop's a beautiful place. It's about 400 years old, and they can get any book you need. But that's not a sponsorship, it's just a mention. But finally, we have yourself, sir, and how people can actually get hold of you and extra stuff.
Extra stuff. Certainly, FlemingMethod.com, you can see on the website there. Hopefully we'll answer a lot of questions for people. YouTube videos, we've done quite a few of them. Not in my wildest imagination did I think I was going to do so many YouTube videos, but yeah.
Are they staying up?
There's a couple
there's a few being taken down. We don't know if this will stay up. We don't even know if this will get up in the first place on YouTube, but we'll see.
Well, we'll certainly find out. I mean, certainly I guess the term that I use for them are trolls out there that just hate it when something gets out that goes against what they personally believe. One of the things that when people behave that way that always sticks in the back of my mind is that when you're so adamant that somebody else is wrong, on treatments or testing or whatever, you have to ask yourself a fundamental question. What happens to you if you become sick or someone you care about suddenly becomes sick and ill? And then I think it changes the perspective considerably. So there are all sorts of people out there that certainly have demonstrated that they have a perspective that they want to continue to perpetuate. But no matter how much power and prestige that gives them, in the end, should they have a problem, should they become ill with it, should they become hospitalized, they have a serious concern and question to raise, which is if the thing that they attack is the very thing that helps them or the person that they love, they've done a tremendous disservice to themselves and to other people in the meantime.
Well, sir, as we say with these things, it's good night from me, which is daylight, and I suppose it's good night from you, sir.
Well, Miles, it's been my pleasure. Thank you for the invitation. I look forward to getting this information shared with people, and hopefully we can help clarify a lot of the misinformation that's out there and help some people. That's the real benefit of this.
Thank you so much, and I will put this on DVD and Blu-ray for the resolution. Those are things called spinning discs you put in some kind of machine. And really, thank you so much. It's a tremendous honor and pleasure, and hopefully this will get out there, and we will get this out there one way or another. But we'll leave those dark forces to let the shadows fall, as they say. Thank you very much. It's been a good 2.5 hours. I'm very honored, and thank you.
Thank you.